Hi guys, I'm Lily. So in this video, we are going to do some detail work over an Everglades painting that I made. I usually like to paint all in one go, but sometimes it really is helpful, especially with oils, to come back in over the top and add a few details that would have just sort of blended in with the other oils if you tried to paint wet on wet. So I'm using here a nickel yellow mixed with a little bit of Cinnabar green light, and there may be a little titanium white mixed in at some point. So I really mixed my own greens for most of this painting, but when it came to adding the details on the top, I knew exactly what it needed. So you can always go back to your palette. The thing about oils is once your painting is dry enough to add some details, your palette could very well still be workable. Mine often is. It really depends on the climate that you're in, whether your air conditioning is on. So for example, I'm in Florida, so in the summer with my AC at full blast, my palette might not still be wet. But at this time of year it is. I'm filming this was in February. So I was able to go back into that palette, but I also knew exactly which colors I wanted. So I'm using that nickel yellow, which is really more like a very, very light lime green, and the Cinnabar green light, which is very similar to my eye, just a little bit of a darker version. I'm also using some Indian yellow here mixed with titanium white. That pretty much sums up all the colors that I used in the detail work. And I went over a little bit of highlights in the grasses that are in the distance. I really love to capture that look of the sunlight moving across the sawgrass, across the Everglades. And I didn't really need to, but while I had that paint on my brush, I decided to add those in. And I'm just adding some grasses here. Again, I hadn't planned on that. I really came to this painting thinking I was just gonna add some more dimension to those lily pads, which is a lot easier to do when you come over the top. So sometimes you get going and you realize that there's a few more things you want to add. If you're an artist and you paint regularly, then you know sometimes it's really hard to stop. So I didn't spend very much time on this. I'd say I probably spent another 30 minutes. But here you can see this is the Cinnabar green light. So I added some light green and some really light green into it. And then I did come along the bottom in a few places and add some more of that Courbet Green. But for the most part, I already had that laid down. So I'm just trying to make them a little more three-dimensional. If you look at lily pads in real life, they're not just flat grasses laying on the surface, flat leaves. They really stick up in a lot of places. A lot of them are heart-shaped. They have a lot of shadows and different colors on them. So they really are very beautiful to paint. And there's something that you can kind of put a lot of thought into. Like I said, they're not just these simple circles laying on the water, which is how we initially will think of them in our mind, or at least how I initially think of them in my mind. They really are much more complex than that. So I added some flowers here too. The white, is much easier to add on top of that dark water if you come back in. And then I thought, you know what, I'm gonna add a few more. So I added some more in there as well. So one thing that's really helpful about waiting for your painting to dry is that you can come in and add these highlights, that unless you've planned it out so perfectly from the beginning, when you try to add brushstrokes like this and the paint is all wet, oil paint will just blend in together to the end of time. So it's possible to do it wet on wet, but it really is helpful to come in and add those in later on. So while it's really possible to do all of this in one go, sometimes when you're just in the flow, you don't plan it out as exact, like the painting really flows as you go. And that makes it a lot easier to come back in once you've sat with it and thought about the different brush strokes and the different colors that you chose, to come back in and really add a few new things to it. You can see here that I am adding some of that Courbet Green, which is really a version of Courbet Green that I mixed up myself using, I believe it was Payne's Gray, Sap Green, and a little bit of cerulean blue. but I'm adding that in around the base of the lily pads. This is another thing that's easier when you come back in at the end, is to add that darkest value. Like, it gives you a chance to really evaluate your painting, because at least for me, that darkest value on the value scale, remember there's 9 levels of shades or value going from white to black, and you really want a full spectrum of that. So when you look at a scene, you can almost always find like the darkest value and the lightest value. And oftentimes for me in my paintings, and I think this is true for a lot of my students as well, it's really easy to get stuck in the middle 6 or 7 values. Or it's easy for us to get the first 6 or 7 values, and those really darker values sometimes get left behind. And I do usually start each painting by laying down the areas of darkest value, because that sort of fixates it in my brain and reminds me that I need to make sure that I have that darkest dark there. But sometimes it also does get a little too covered up as we go along. So that's one thing, that if I do come in at the end and add some details onto the dry paint, I always try to remember not to just add the brightest brights, but to go in again with the darkest darks as well. And I find, at least when I'm viewing other paintings, the ones that look the best to me and that really look the most believable to my eye, to my brain, whether or not they're meant to be realistic paintings, the ones that really just seem to work, they all have that darkest value in there. So I think that that's really important. And while it's so important, it's always something that is easy to sort of forget. So anyways, thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, please reach out, leave a comment, or shoot me a message. And I am always happy to give a little more detail on my process. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and happy painting.